So I was recently asked why I like using Recoil's Atom family to store state in my apps. And my answer was basically because it's a really great way to build very, very well-performing apps in React. So let's dive into this a little bit deeper. So I love using React context to manage my app-wide state over something like Redux or MobX. Its simplicity and lack of boilerplate make it a great state management solution. But React context has one big limitation that can really hurt your app's performance. And a new library called Recoil can help with this. So today I want to take a look at one of Recoil's most powerful features, Atom Family. So let's start by looking at the problem. We have this prototyping tool and we have two rectangles on the canvas. You can see performance is pretty good. And we're only re-rendering the items that need to change, right? So as I drag this square over here, only it re-renders and nothing else does. And that's because each rectangle stores its state in its own component, meaning if we change any of the properties of that element, then only that element component will re-render. But what if we wanted to add this sidebar that has access to this rectangle state? Well, the only way to really accomplish this is to hoist the rectangle state up into a common parent component. But that means every time we change the state of one rectangle, they would all re-render. This is fine for most use cases, but when you're dealing with a large number of frequently updating items, then you have a problem. And the limitation here is that you can't subscribe to just parts of the context that stores all of the items. And we can't create a context for each item because we can't dynamically create context like this. But Recoil kind of gives you context on steroids. We can store each item in its own piece of shareable state, kind of like multi-context, and we'll only re-render what we need to, making the performance of this app scale as we add more objects onto the canvas. So let's take this slow app and supercharge it using Recoil. And you can clone this repo if you want to code along. The link is in the description. Also, if you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. And be sure to give me a like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe if you want to see more. Let's just quickly dive into what this app does. I can click Insert over here, which will insert some rectangles with a random color. I can then drag each rectangle around, which will change its top and left positions. And you can see the way this works is I have a left sidebar, a canvas in the middle, a right sidebar, and then I have some global styles as well. So what we do when we insert a new element is we push a new ID into this array of elements up here at the top. And we make this array of IDs accessible to the canvas. And inside of the canvas, we just map over the element IDs just to render out each element. And then each element stores its own top, left, and color states. And this is actually really good because whenever we drag this element, we're calling a set top and set left function within the element itself, which will only update this component and not the whole app. And this gives us great performance that scales as we add more elements. But as we already saw, the problem is if we want to take that state and share it with another component, let's say with a sidebar, which we're going to be adding here, we need to take the state and lift it up. And that is where our performance falls down. So now that we have a good idea for the basic layout of our app and where all the code lives, let's dive right in. So the first thing I'm going to do is add Recoil. And now that we've added Recoil, we need to import Recoil root from Recoil. And we're going to wrap our app in this Recoil root component. I'm going to head over to my element component. And instead of storing our state in these separate use state values over here, I'm going to store the state in what is called an atom family. So let's import atom family from Recoil. And now we're going to create a new atom family. Just call it element state. And we need to give the atom family a key. So let's just call it element and a default value. And our default value is just going to be top 0, left 0. And the color is just going to be a random material design color, which we'll get using this handy library over here. And now instead of these use states, we're going to remove that and import use recoil state instead from Recoil. And here we're going to bring in our use recoil state hook, pass in our atom family, and to our atom family, we will pass the ID of the element. So let's bring in the ID as a prop. So let's add it. And now here I will get my element state and the ability to set my element. And you can see that this looks very similar to a use state. But instead of setting some state that lives in this component specifically, we're setting some state that lives outside of the component that can be shared. So let's just pull in some values here. So this is going to be element.top, element.left. The color is going to be element.color. And we're just going to do the same over here. But because we don't have separate state values for top and left here anymore, I'm just going to call set element instead, spread in the current value of element, and then our new top and left values. And then we just need to change the usage of top and left over here as well. All right, and one last thing to do is head over back to the canvas and pass this element ID in as a prop to the element, because remember, we need to use that to create a specific atom instance for that specific element. Okay, great. So we can still insert elements. Just one problem is that all the elements are being inserted with the same color. And that's because this default object over here for our atom family only gets evaluated once, meaning this random color only gets generated once and is used as the default value for all new atoms. So what we can do here is just wrap the default value in a function that returns this object, meaning that every time we create a new atom, this function is going to run and return a new object each time for each new element and give us a unique random color for every element we insert. Okay, great. That's working brilliantly. So we have the same functionality that we did when our state lived inside our element component. So now we're in our right sidebar component, which is going to be the component to the right of the app here, which will have some values that we can change on this selected element. So first we need a place to store the ID of the currently selected element. So let's head back to our element component and import atom from Recoil. So let's create an atom called selected element ID state. Give it a key, which will be selected element ID. And the default value will be null, but I just want to tell TypeScript that this can be either null or a number. And now let's import use set recoil state from Recoil and create a new variable here called set selected element and call use set recoil state. And now we pass in our selected element ID state atom. And now on this container, we're going to add an onClick. And in the onClick, we're going to set the selected element to this current element's ID. Now we can export this atom as well. Head back to our right sidebar. And now we can import use recoil value from Recoil. And we can also import from our element, our selected element ID state. And what we can do here is call our use recoil value hook, pass in our selected element ID state, and let's just log it for now. And then let's just add a label so that we know what we're looking at in the logs. So you can see I have a few elements over here. And whenever I click on one of the elements, it's going to set the selected element value to the ID of that element. This is great and all, but we actually don't just want the element ID. We need to be able to get and set the color of the element as well as the top and left values. So we can use a selector for this. So let's import selector from Recoil, and let's also import our element state. So now let's create a new selector. So let's say selected element state and make it a selector. I'm going to say the key is going to be selected element, and we're going to pass a get function to the selector. And this get function actually gives us another get function. So let's get the value of our selected element ID state, which will give us the ID of the currently selected element. So if our ID is not equal to null, then we're going to return the value of our element state for this ID. Great. So now instead of fetching our selected element ID over here, let's instead pass in our selector to the use recoil value hook. So when we insert a new element and we select it, you can see that we can now get the value of that specific element state. So now we can remove our console log, and let's pass in the color value to our color picker and the top value to our top input and the left value to our left input. And now you can see whenever I select an element, the sidebar changes and we see the values for that specific element. And as we drag that selected element around, you can see that the values here change. And this is great. And here's the best part. If I highlight component updates using the React Dev tools, only the element that we change still updates. We don't have that same problem of having potentially hundreds of elements on the page and them all having to re-render just because we want to share state between the element and the sidebar. But now we want to be able to set our current element state as well. Well, a selector actually allows you to set values. So let's look at how that works. So first, we're going to change our use recoil value hook to a use recoil state hook, which is going to allow us to get both the value of that selector and a set function, which will allow us to set the value of that selector. So we need to implement a set function. So let's add a set function. And the set function actually gives us a set and a get function. So first, we need to know the current ID of the selected element. And now, just to be safe, we're still going to add in a check to make sure that there is actually an element that's selected. And now what we can do is we can set our element state for that specific element. And this set function is going to give us the new element value that we pass into our set selected element. So now what we can do is whenever the color picker value changes, we can call set selected element, spread in the current value of that element, but then pass in our new color value. And we can do the same for top and the same for left. So now what happens is our color picker value changes. We call set selected element, which will pass this new object to our selector, which will get the current selected element ID, make sure that we have one selected, and then set that specific atom in that element state atom family to the new value that we passed in down here. Let's see this in action. So I've inserted 3 elements here. And if I select the orange one and change the color, you can see that it changes and only this element still re-renders. Same with the top value and the left value. And if I select this one, same thing. And this is one of the most common use cases of Recoil, where you have a large number of frequently updating items, and it wouldn't make sense to store all of that state in one context value. So I hope this gave you a good idea of how to use Recoil when you need to store state for multiple items, and when you might want to use this kind of technique. Thanks for watching, thanks for making it all the way to the end, and if you enjoyed this, please give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more.